Okay, well, we are excited that next week we're going to launch into the first set of Jesus' teachings and the Sermon on the Mount as we talk about anger. But before we embark into all these practical teachings that he gave, we just want to take kind of the 10,000-foot view today of the Sermon on the Mount and where we're going through this. And so our bottom line today is living like Jesus so we can love like Jesus. And that phrase, that sentence may sound familiar to you if you've been around with us a little while, because we spent the last school year going through a series like this, but it was centered around the idea of, it was called Inhabit, and it was the idea of cultivating spiritual formation habits that we see modeled in the life of Jesus. So we're learning to live like Jesus. And we spent like 9 months talking about that. And in many ways, we see this Sermon on the Mount series as the second part of that.
Sure.
Learning to love.
Right, it was learning to live like Jesus so that we can love like Jesus. And there's a sense in these practical teachings, maybe a more detailed approach to Jesus' teachings, where we see a link to what he would say is the greatest commandment. You know,
Right.
Jesus did a great job defining for us all of the law and prophets hinge on or hang on these two things, which of course is
Loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Don't you love it when it puts
you
you
get put on the spot, right?
And loving your neighbor as yourself. I feel like I would have lost my job in that moment if I
Well, I just know everyone in the room, too, is like, what is it? Well, these are the two greatest commands, right? According to Jesus. And in a sense, we see then that the Sermon on the Mount is a working out, perhaps,
in a practical level.
of that at a practical level, which I think is one important thing for us to hone in on, is that, again, Jesus' approach is not just lofty ideals. It is saying these things that I'm talking about are meant to put into practice. And so you work out these ideals of loving God and loving neighbor in practical ways. And that's exactly what we see in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, there's going to have to be some cultural translation. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the world has changed a lot since the first century. You know, it feels like it's changed a lot in our lifetimes, you know, and we've only been around for 40 years, and both hit that milestone this year. So, you know, if the world has changed that fast, I mean, we're dealing with things now at a practical level that our parents didn't deal with, that we didn't even used to deal with. And so clearly, some of the details are going to be different. And yet, as you look through this list on your paper today, you see all of this is alive and well
topic,
today.
So to speak, is so relevant to what we personally wrestle with as we work out our faith, and just the human experience that we see around us. And then the challenge will become for us to say, okay, well then how do the principles that Jesus offers around each of these topics, how does that practically translate to outside of, first century Israel to United States of America 2022? What does that look like? How do we practically apply it so that we can put it into practice? We're living like Jesus so that we can love like Jesus. Here's what love on display looks like, right?
And I think it's important to note as we get practical that this is not to be like a burdensome list of things of Jesus laying out your to-do list of, check all these boxes every day, be perfect, Inhabit, where we were last year, living like Jesus. We still have to bear that in mind. Like the idea is to habitually live in such a way that we're becoming someone new that can do these things. Like that these things become something that come easily to us. More easily as we practice the way of Jesus.
Oh, and that's the idea here. Don't discard living like Jesus as we're kind of leaning into the loving like Jesus aspect, because we really only can love like him, can put into practice this way of being human when we're anchored to some of those practices. And so if you weren't here with us last year at Inhabit, I'm sure some folks in your group were, and we'll do our best to link and remind, refresh some of those practices, because there's going to be times where, well, every time, abiding alone with God and communing with him in prayer over some of the topics we're going to delve into. Man, that intimacy with him is going to help us be able to do some work, allow him to do some work in us through these teachings, or fasting, or, even choosing not to be as distracted by things so that we can lean into. So all these practices actually help serve the pursuit, so to speak, of saying, God, I want to love like Jesus loved. I want to relate with people like Jesus related. I want to know God the way that Jesus knew God. I want to know my neighbor the way that Jesus was able to relate to his neighbors.
Yeah. So as you look through this list and you maybe identify things that maybe hit close to home for you, I don't want you to feel
don't block out that month on your calendar. Like, I'm not coming. I'm not coming in October.
Exactly. Right? Like, what you're not going to hear there is like, stop it, just stop it. Like, in your own willpower, just stop being angry, or stop, lusting. Why are you doing that? Like, that's not going to be the tenor or the tone of this, because we believe that Jesus not only teaches a better way of life, but provides his Spirit to us. And so really what we're going to be learning about is how to walk in step with his Spirit in these things that plague us and wreck our lives. And how do we find freedom then to live the way he wanted us to live? I mean, that's really the hope.
Since we're using this metaphor of ascending, think about hikes that I've been on, and knowing, I know some people we traveled with this summer at some national parks. So like, well, is the 7-mile hike, like, what's the payoff? Like, what are we going to see at the summit? Like, is it worth the slog, to get there? And so I think there's some of that too, as we're getting ready to go on this intensive journey, so to speak, of hearing Jesus' teachings about these areas that are really close to home, is saying, like, yeah, there's going to be some payoff. And what could that be? What would it look like if I literally could become a less angry person? How would that impact my relationships? What would it look like if I didn't objectify people? What would it look like if I really could forgive my offender? Like, what kind of freedom comes from that? And there is some beauty, as instead of looking at it as what you're saying, like there's going to be this condemnation. Instead, what is the invitation of Jesus to us as he invites us into this way of living?
And it's not even just for us. That's the beauty of this too, is yes, you and I can experience incredible freedom through this, but Jesus' vision is so much bigger. He says, you're going to be, like, when you're living like this, remember, you're going to be the salt of the world, the light of the world. Like, you're going to bless others in your relationships when you learn to live like Jesus, so you can love like Jesus. It's going to change the fabric of this whole community, and it's going to be really cool to watch.
So don't feel like it's daunting. It's exciting. And we're going to stay in step with the Spirit, and we're going to stay in step with each other, shoulder to shoulder on this journey.